We're going to charge ahead now with a thought leadership panel. We're diving headlong into the critical issue of ESG. We are really honored and happy to be joined by Onyen, who's providing a very powerful ESG reporting platform. We are being joined by Laurie Clark, who is herself a powerful force in this industry. Laurie is president and director and CEO of Onyen. She's a global finance executive who used to build trading and securities exchange systems, and now she's turned her focus squarely to Onyen, Planet Earth's ESG reporting solution. Laurie is presently the founder of 3 financial technology companies, who also started, grew, and sold 3 prior companies, and she was twice awarded Top 100 Most Powerful Women in Canada in 2017 and in 2019. Did I not tell you that Laurie's a juggernaut? Laurie is an independent corporate director and presently the chair of the board for Ethel Capital Corporation, a private equity company, and independent board of director for North American Futures, Options, and Swaps Security Exchange. Laurie is a member of the TMX Advisory Council. She's a member of the Canadian RegTech Association, the CRTA, Strategic Advisory Council, and a member of the advisory board for Pelangio Exploration. Laurie also advises, invests in, or capital raises for private and for public companies. Laurie, welcome to the Global Mining Symposium. It's great to have you here. How are you doing today?
Good morning to the West Coast and good afternoon to the East Coast.
And where are you?
The West Coast. I'm in Kelowna.
You're in Kelowna. Okay, we had 2 people. I'm doing our own little survey here. We had 2 from Kelowna yesterday, so you're our first today from Kelowna. But we do have a strong representation out here in the West. So welcome to you from Kelowna.
Well, thank you very much, Anthony, and it's a pleasure to be here. And welcome everyone to our wonderful thought leadership session. We are so proud to be sponsoring this panel of experts that come from all across North America and have such rich and diverse expertise. And to that end, as you say, I used to build trading systems and securities exchange systems. And now Onyen was sort of born out of the need to try to bring together all of these conundrums that we live in with regards to all of the mishmash of standards and rating agencies and trying to figure it all out. And what Onyen has done is very simple, and that is to bring that kind of expertise to the forefront in, dealing with that massive data set and massive, information deluge, so that we can manage it more effectively. And so I think I'd like to try to emphasize 3 main points, if I could. What we've done is we've aligned with all the global standards and the frameworks, and we've scaled it for size and for the stage of business development for all mid-tier down. We've also ensured that the final product is an ESG, for ESG disclosure document, such as an ESG scorecard and a sustainability report, because they are 2 very different things. One is driven for the stakeholders, key stakeholders, and another one is driven to the rating agencies, and that's very, very important. And also, I think that what we want to do is make it an easy tool with a lot of with built-in management tools. So it becomes, because one of the things that I want to get across, data, as your previous guest was saying, data, intelligent data, has to speak to you. It cannot just be a static event on a system. And in order to do that, in order to drive that, you have to have tools that drive almost an AI capability so that you get intelligent data back, so that you can actually make informed decision and manage your outcomes. So it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of this session, and it is Ingrid Hibberd. And Ingrid is a wonderful, I count her amongst one of the women that I admire and I look to. And also she is certainly a powerhouse in her own right. She is the CEO and director of Pelangio Exploration. She is an international mining CEO with a ton of experience, over 30 years, spanning all facets of the mineral resources industry, from early stage exploration to mine development and production. Of course, an independent director and board advisor on numerous corporate boards. And prior to her stewardship of public companies, she began her career in mining by practicing corporate and securities law, with clients ranging from multinational mining operators to mineral resource explorers and individual prospectors. Now, the most notable achievement, of course, that she is always, heralded for is negotiating the acquisition of the Detour Gold mine property for Pelangio Mines and participating in founding Detour Gold Corp, and which attained a market cap in excess of $5 billion. And she also negotiated the acquisition of a district size and land package in Ghana, adjacent to the 70 million ounce Obuasi mine owned by Anglo Gold Ashanti. It's my very, very great pleasure to introduce Ingrid. Thank you very much, Ingrid, for joining us.
Thanks for having me. So I'm really pleased to be talking, really moderating. So mostly listening and guiding and hopefully asking some good questions on this topic of reshaping risk, the future of ESG integration and reporting. So I want to take a few minutes and introduce our three panelists today. So first is Meghan Harris-Ngae. She's with a partner with EY in the Climate Change and Sustainability group. I am going to keep them short, so the longer introductions are available on the website, because this is an esteemed panel, and as you can see, we could all go on for a long time of mutual admiration society. So Meghan has had experience working with multinational organizations in Europe and North America to develop strategies to address climate change and other environmental, social, and governance, ESG matters that have a significant impact, among other things, and importantly for the companies themselves, on access to and retention of capital. So welcome, Meghan. In addition, we have Richard Harris. Dr. Richard Harris is a PhD geologist with 33 years of experience in Zimbabwe, South Africa, Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, Argentina, Brazil, and Venezuela. So with that, and he's a director of Aurania. So with that, I'm not going to tell you all about his discoveries, but suffice to say, he successfully led multiple teams to multiple discoveries. Also with us is Edie Hofmeister. Edie is an attorney who has counseled large and small multinational companies on legal and ESG matters, including in her previous role as EVP of Corporate Affairs and General Counsel for Tahoe Resources Americas. Currently, she's a public company director and consultant, and the vice chair of the International Bar Association's Business and Human Rights Committee. So I can hardly wait to have the opportunity to pick all your brains and see where we get with this. So, one of the first questions, Meghan, that, let's start with a quick overview of some of the anticipated mandatory disclosures and also provide some insight into when and how they're expected to impact financial statements and corporate disclosure, because I think that's a great place to start so people can kind of understand what's coming.
Sure. Thanks, Ingrid. And just to level set that the ESG disclosure space is quite challenging. And I think Laurie provided, that as part of her introduction in terms of the amount of shift that's happening in the ESG disclosure space. If we talk about what's coming just from a regulatory perspective globally, climate change is the area where we're starting to see more and more standardization from a regulatory perspective. There's a standard, or I wouldn't call it a standard, a framework called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And disclosure in line with those recommendations has now become mandatory in the UK. What we're starting to see in North America specifically is that the SEC, for example, has issued guidance on climate risk disclosure. And even this morning, I got calls from clients that are now receiving letters from the SEC because they're reviewing their financial filings and starting to ask questions around climate risk. And we expect that there will be more guidance and requirements issued by the SEC in terms of what needs to be disclosed in financial filings related to climate change risk. The other area that we're seeing in Canada is that the securities regulators are now starting to do something similar to what the SEC is doing. And last but not least, the accounting bodies. So for those of you familiar with the IFRS or the IFRS Foundation, they are now driving towards standardization of ESG disclosure. And they're going to leverage some of the standards that are out there, and there are many. One example would be the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, also known as SASB. They would be one of the most well-adopted standards, I would say, in North America, because they focus very much at a sector level. Again, that disclosure against that standard is not mandatory as of yet, but what we're starting to see is the accounting bodies pick up these standards and start to say, okay, what do we need to do in terms of issuing, essentially requirements in our accounting standards. So all that being said, it is a challenging space to navigate because of the number of standards. And so in terms of impact, I would say that's the biggest impact is, for any organization trying to determine where to start, where to focus. And I would say, just given what's happening globally, it doesn't matter what sector you operate in, but specifically in mining, focusing on climate risk would be the area to start because it is considered to be one of the most material issues in the ESG space, but don't ignore other aspects of ESG. And really level set on which standard you want to adopt. I would say TCFD for climate change is the one I would recommend, and the other one would be SASB if you're actually looking for frameworks to get started with any type of disclosure as it relates to ESG.
It sounds more than a little daunting.
Yes, yeah, so it is daunting.
Maybe you can expand on that, and particularly, I think you've got some maybe visuals either now or later that show how quickly things are evolving and how difficult it is for companies to kind of be adapting quickly enough to deal with this, especially the smaller companies.
Oh, Edie, you're on mute, actually. Just in the bottom left-hand corner, you should see the unmute button on your screen. And let me see if I can do it for you. There we go. There you go.
Oh, awesome. Thanks for taking care of that. Oop.
No, I think it's on your end, Edie. Sorry. Yeah, we'll keep moving, but I'll work on the back end to get you going.
So yeah, so let's leave. Well, we can leave those up, and in the meantime, Meghan, maybe a little bit about what's the biggest challenge in actually, how can people kind of go about implementing all these? Because you were talking about so many standards. Are we developing, the Onyen is sponsoring this, so it's one. I guess there are some platforms that are developing that provide some sense of automation and AI that are going to help some of the smaller companies.
Yes, I would say there's a number of different solutions from a technology perspective, and having personally seen the Onyen solution, it's excellent. In terms of really being comprehensive in terms of what it can do. I would say the recommendation I would have, for an organization that's just getting started on this journey is to not only focus on disclosure, but to think about, how ESG, should be prioritized in your organization. Focus on your strategy and your program first before going down the path of disclosure. The tail shouldn't wag the dog. And frankly, there are these challenges now. I even just got off a call with a CEO this morning that is being, an organization that is being accused of greenwashing, or another term would be ESG washing. So being very, focused on, again, what your policies and practices are around ESG, understand what your priorities should be in terms of, what your stakeholders care about as it relates to ESG, as well as how those ESG issues affect your organization, so that you can determine what needs to be a priority. And from there, determine what your disclosure should look like. Choose the standards that you think you should adopt based on, again, where you operate. and then start to focus on disclosure. I've seen a lot of examples of companies that have focused on disclosure first, and then it becomes very, very challenging to figure out, what your strategy is. So I would start with the strategy and program first. And then just pace yourself. You're not going to do this all at once. I have clients that have taken 3 years to get their programs in place. So, obviously recognize what's happening on the regulatory side, but don't feel that you need to essentially do it all in 6 months.
So Richard, I bet you can chime in here because both you and I are running junior companies. And in fact, the biggest issue, and especially for an exploration company, we're often the first people on the ground. So there's a whole bunch of social issues or social assistance, or however you want to describe it, that needs to be dealt with. And that's really what's driving us. And the disclosure is just, something that comes after. So, maybe you could talk about managing some of the risks and then how you go about disclosing them.
Yeah, Ingrid, I would absolutely support that comment, and I'm delighted to hear Meghan talking along those lines as well, because disclosure is actually the last thing that we think about. I mean, what we are trying to do is create value for our shareholders. We are trying to make discoveries of significant deposits, which means that we're interacting with the people right from the outset. Each geologist that has boots on the ground, he or she is the person that's carrying the flag for not only the company, but for the industry. And, that's what we're focused on. The reporting is something that follows. And, that's where we are so incredibly thankful as Aurania to Onyen and Laurie and the system that they set up, because we started looking into the disclosure. And it was an absolute minefield. We actually we spent a lot of time on it last year, and there was no way that we could do it just as a company whose priority is to create value for its shareholders rather than reporting. So, Onyen has been the system that has allowed us to tell the world what we are doing on the ESG side. But the critical thing is that our focus is what we're doing in the field. We're working with Indigenous groups that have been forgotten by everyone, forgotten by the government, and we're starting from absolute scratch. And the reporting is something that sort of comes second, and we're delighted to be involved with that now.
So to some extent, Ingrid, disclosure isn't just a negative. It's actually an opportunity to tell your story. And for companies at the early stage like us, we recognize it's a journey. We're not going to be able to have all of the bells and whistles in place immediately. But there's an old saying: you can only improve what you measure. And if you don't start measuring, then you're not going to drive improvement. Edie, are you able to chime in now? Are you here?
I hope so. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes. Welcome, Edie.
Great. Okay. So sorry about that technical issue. I'm on my phone now, actually. Could we go to the slides, and I'll actually quickly kind of go through what I'm seeing in terms of the landscape. And I have a tiny history lesson. A picture speaks 1,000 words, but is there one before that? Yeah. So, well, this stole my thunder, but you can see, no, go to the one, go to that one. Thanks. So in the key there, this is for the landscape of kind of legal and hard and soft standards in 2000. So we have depicted on the slide, prepared by my colleague Elise Gruth, international soft laws. We have standards and contracts, which would relate to our supplier relationships and obligations. We have a duty of care reflected in the 2000, and you could see in the 2000 slide really just 10 standards really, and then fast forward 20 years, and in 2020. We have, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, and many of which are becoming many of which are mandatory. So I think for this group, the big ones that we're seeing in Canada in terms of mandatory disclosure and vigilance are, more in the way of case law. We've had the Hudbay case was the first one in which a parent company was sued for alleged human rights abuses in Guatemala. Then we had the Tahoe case, Garcia versus Tahoe, that I was unfortunately intimately familiar with, where the Canadian Supreme Court said it's okay to sue parents for, in-country alleged human rights harms. And then, of course, right after that, we had Neb's son, where that was expanded. So in addition to this parent company liability that we're seeing, we also have a lot of legislative changes beyond just disclosure. We have, a duty of care and vigilance before we start a project, and we see this in France. We see it in the Modern Slavery Act that the UK has passed. Canada, I think, is going to be passing a Modern Slavery Act in the next year. That's well along in Canadian legislature. So these things are here, and more, and it keeps going back and forth, which makes it even scarier. But more and more of them, companies need to take a look at not just the legal, but kind of what's beyond that.
I love these slides, Edie, because, I've been doing this for a little over 20 years, and you've just explained to me why my life has got so much more complicated. I kept feeling it, but I couldn't put my finger at it. So,
and it's there. And if 2021, there'd be about, 40 more on there. So.
So, now that you're both here, because I do want to take a few minutes back on, and we are kind of short on time, but this idea of greenwashing, I want to get into it a little bit and see, actually it was a term I hadn't really, when we were talking previously, I went, greenwashing, what the heck is that? So maybe you can give me a little bit of how companies can avoid that.
Is that a question for me?
Well, both of you actually. So Megan, maybe you start, and then.
Sure. So greenwashing is a term that's been around for a long time, but it essentially means that, you put out, a statement or statements of what you're doing from a environmental perspective, but those, statements that you're making may not be true, or you can't actually prove that they are true, or they're being put out for reputational gain and aren't a true reflection of what you're actually doing as an organization. And one of the famous examples would be what Volkswagen went through recently, but there are other examples. And so now we're starting to hear this term ESG washing. So it's not just about environmental, it's about essentially what you put out or disclose around ESG and what you're doing from an ESG perspective, but that you can't prove it or you can't demonstrate that you're actually doing those things. And so there's been a lot of discussion lately around that, which some of these standards are really looking to address, right? But it is really important that what you do put out in your disclosure, that you can stand behind it. And that becomes more challenging, with access to data, which I think we're going to talk about, today as well. But to be very careful with what you put out there, and don't just put it out there for marketing purposes, because that's essentially where greenwashing was born. It was really out of marketing. But maybe Edie, do you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy, I think, to, say you're doing all these great things when no one's verifying it. But I'd also say on the other side of it, a lot of people use this term, it's just a check the box exercise, kind of meaning that, there's not a lot of substance behind it. But I think that companies can check we have to check the boxes. The securities administrators and the BlackRocks and all the demands on companies, we are going through checking boxes all the time. And I think the point is just, to build on what Megan was saying, is to make those box checks meaningful so that you are doing them, and not to put too many in front of you. So, if you're a small or medium enterprise, you don't have to check every box. You have to, do your assessment on ESG early. I always say, get on it. You guys are exploring and you have teams of geologists and mining engineers, and, we're the ESG people from day one, right? They're, maybe there's a few in the field, but you need to bring a real, high level, some expertise there, and do your materiality assessment and find the boxes that you really need to check. Don't try to check every box, because as an SME, which is the company I work for the last 10 years, it becomes you just can't do it. You don't have the resources to do it. It doesn't make any sense. You're not an ESG company or a mining company. So you really got to get your team together and get some expertise and find the right boxes for you to check.
So that really fits into the whole title of the topic here, right? It ties into your risk assessment, and by doing sort of that risk assessment, you can focus on the boxes that you most need to pay attention to so that you can check them. So what do you think, Richard, in terms of ESG integration challenges? So how are you finding getting the data out of the field and into whatever system you're going to use to report? Oh,
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, our ESG team goes in first before any geologist hits the ground. And, I quite honestly, I find this ticking of boxes quite objectionable. We're there to do a good job. We are there to make discoveries that benefit not only our shareholders, but the local people. And, I think it's self-checking. I think it's self-regulating, because if we're not doing a good job on the ESG, we will never, ever be able to mine. So, I think that, what is happening in the field is absolutely fundamental. And again, I come back to it. The checking of the boxes is completely secondary to the real world that's out there. So, we are, the reporting, as you mentioned earlier, Ingrid, is hugely important, because, we're so busy doing the work that it doesn't occur to us a lot of the time to actually count what we're doing or measure this or measure that. And, the ONYEN system helps us. It has helped us to develop a sort of internal reporting system that says to everyone within the organization, and it's critical that the leadership leads, so that everyone else is on the same page, to make sure that all of the data is being collected as it goes, so that we can measure it. And one of the things that I found while we were doing this scorecard and associated report is that there were things in there that I quite honestly hadn't actually really thought about. It hadn't occurred to me, and so suddenly we're measuring those things, because they're things that we hadn't measured before, but we could. So there's a huge opportunity here for us to conform with the regulatory requirements, but in my view, as a secondary component to actually doing the job well in the field and driving towards making a discovery that is going to be accepted by the local populace, whoever that is, to give one the social license to go into production somewhere down the road.
So we have heard stories, and maybe even had it happen to us, where we focus most as companies on the ground and the stakeholders that are affected in the communities, but institutional investors are also now looking for more and more of this information. And I think that this is going to be something, and whatever system you choose to use, however you use it, telling the story is important, both on all sides, for your existing investors, for new investors, and as you kind of grow and get a bigger institutional following, you will have a huge advantage in sort of being one of the first movers in this area.
Agreed.
If there are any questions, we're happy to take them. Otherwise, we can continue just chatting.
There are a bunch of questions here. Yes. So great job, panelists. You guys really hit upon the big issues of the day. We have one here from Anne. Anne says, value reporting foundation characteristics, the SASB standards and the TCFD as a framework. How do you think about the difference? I guess the difference between SASB and TCFD, are they complementary? Do they sit well together? And any thoughts on local procurement reporting mechanism?
Who wants to go first? Edie, maybe?
Oh, I think that's a Meghan.
Okay.
Okay, I can answer that one. So yeah, there's been a lot of change. So the Value Reporting Foundation is essentially the new name for the merger between SASB and the International Integrated Reporting Committee. They came together and formed the Value Reporting Foundation. And then TCFD is separate from that foundation. But what I do know is that they're working very closely together to make sure that that the Value Reporting Foundation doesn't do something that essentially contradicts what TCFD has recommended. The difference between the two is that what TCFD drives towards is more the governance of climate change with disclosure recommendations around, strategy, how you're factoring climate risk into your risk management process. And then what SASB does is it focuses more on the metrics. So an example would be you would report your greenhouse gas metrics under SASB. So that's where the intersection really happens. SASB doesn't tell you what to report out on your governance of climate risk. That's what TCFD does. But they're working very closely together to make that more clear. Because I know that because I live in this space every day, but I can understand why there'd be confusion because it's not clear. And I think there was the second part of that question was around procurement standards.
That's right. Yeah. How do you, yes. Any thoughts on local procurement reporting mechanisms?
I don't know, Edie, if you have maybe a better answer than I would on the procurement side.
I have a more general answer. I mean, it really depends on your jurisdiction and your, like a lot of, if you're incorporated in, European or North American jurisdiction, you're going to have different reporting requirements on procurement and supply side impacts and relationships. So it just really depends on what jurisdiction you're in. But where I live in California, they have the California Supply Chain Act that a lot of countries are now using as a model. So you want to identify your legal landscape, and then if you're in in a remote area where it's hard to track down those kinds of relationships, I would urge people to kind of seek out expertise and to understand the extent to which you need to report on those kinds of relationships, or that you need to do, what kind of due diligence do you need to do, kind of track down whether there's some criminality going on in a supply chain. That's a very general, unsatisfying answer, I'm sure, but it really depends on where you are.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you, Edie. We have one here from Barb picking up along the same thing. So I think we'll start with Megan on this one. Just looking for more detail on just what the actual practical implications are for companies on, you mentioned that IFRS is looking at adapting SASB standards. So what would be disclosed in financial statements? Like, how is this actually going to play through? Their last point is, so far as I know, there is currently no required ESG reporting, but will that change in Canada?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and having been closely tied to some of the discussions and commentary that we've provided to the IFRS Foundation is exactly that. They have not quite figured out how this is going to flow through to financial statements. What I can say, and what's likely to hit first, is disclosure on climate change risk. And so that standard TCFD is the one to look at, because that's the one that's informing what the Canadian securities regulators are focused on. And that's also where IFRS is likely to move to first. you can expect likely within the next month that the IFRS is going to come out with more information on climate risk specifically, because they have indicated that's where they're going to start. And the TCFD does explain in detail how to assess your exposure to both physical climate risk as well as transition risk. And I won't get into all the details, but that would be where I would recommend you start, because that's what's likely to get required. It's likely to be required in disclosure. Now, what I will say is that what's interesting is that where it's likely to be required is probably in the MD&A. They haven't quite figured out how they're going to regulate, for example, financial disclosure around climate risk. So that ability to quantify, you know, how exposed you are to climate change. There isn't a standard methodology to do that yet. And so I don't expect the securities regulators to move to that point yet because of that lack of standardization. But they likely will require disclosure in the MD&A around how you assess your risk and what you're doing to mitigate that risk. So that would be where
Megan, did you say off the top of your comments that in the UK, they're already aligning with TCFD? And if so,
Yep.
how is that being implemented? Is it a requirement within their financial statements?
It is. So the UK, in the UK, they've actually mandated TCFD disclosure, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in the financial filings. Right now, it's actually most organizations are just issuing a separate TCFD report. But they have made it mandatory in the UK, and that was the one jurisdiction globally. But we're expecting to see that come in North America as well.
Okay. This next one, I think, is for Laurie, actually. So tying it all up to Onyen, the question pretty straightforward. How can Onyen help companies with disclosures for financing?
Oh, well. So let me tell you a direct story that I'm going to use as an example, and you can't make this stuff up. And that is one of our customers, and I'll leave it to them to publicize how this works. But anyway, I got this wonderful email one day, and it said, "Onyen, the system that keeps on giving." And and usually customers call up to ask for something or to complain because something's that they want something more. But this was an amazing email from one of our customers that said that their financiers in Europe, where this is mandatory, they needed to have, they required certain disclosures, and they wanted it very specific disclosures. And because our system deals with all of them, they were hooped. They thought, oh my goodness, it's going to take us months to put this information together. But actually, they went into the system. They realized they had the disclosure right there in front of them. They put it together in a customized sort of framework for the financiers. And they not only received they kept their funding, but they increased their funding. So you can't make stories like that up. And it really shows in a very practical sense what the results are when you have an automated tool and an automated system. I hate calling it a tool because it's a hell of a lot more than that. An automated system that not only drives information and data your way, but actually starts to talk to you. It starts to demonstrate what you are doing in very, very fundamental ways. And now with AI capabilities, it's going to do so much more.
Well, that's the perfect segue to this question, Laurie. So we'll stay with you for this one. So it's along these lines, maybe just going a little bit further down the road. The question is, how will AI actually help the junior, small cap, and mid cap companies with their ESG reporting?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. Holy cow. How many technologists are in the crowd? So AI is an interesting, it's an interesting field. And a lot of people, okay. So remember, my background is securities exchanges and building trading systems and whatnot. And I'm sort of well known in North America because they took, a real time. What we used to call real time is now called today AI. Okay. When we were building real time systems, what it did for smaller companies, especially in Vancouver and Toronto and the US, it gave them the power of data at their fingertips at every moment. So what we've done with our system is now an executive, say, for example, Ingrid or Richard, at their companies, they have an executive dashboard that they can go in and on a daily, monthly, or annual basis, depending on how fast their data is changing on them and how the inputs are you know, integrated, because, you know, we can do manual, we can do uploads, or we can actually API, which is application program interface. So we actually talk to other systems automatically. And so that drives the all sorts of reporting in real-time sense, right? Actual review, so that you have minute-to-minute updates of what's going on in your company on a global basis. But not only that, then you can have your comparison levels and your deltas, and it starts to notify you from one reporting period to the next whether there are any, you know, variances, whether you have perhaps, you know, for example, it'll say, well, you on your GHG emissions were actually focused on this, but this year you're focused on that. What happened? What's changed? And those are the type of notifications and alerts that are extremely important and impactful to a company, because they need to then manage what's going on in their company. They can actually see what the data is telling them. And that is what you want. You want systems that are not only easy, consistent, you want, you know, the ease of being able to manage all these, you know, huge data sets, but you also want the information that's coming to you to actually be understood and to talk to you a little bit more aggressively or assertively, so that you can manage your outcomes. So as an executive, as a board of director, you can make informed decisions about what you're experiencing and what the data is telling you. And that is where AI is going. It's going to be extremely powerful for the team, you know, running the company.
Excellent. I guess in that sense, sorry.
Just to add that, you know, it's a great equalizer, right? Because it's something that, you know, the small and medium enterprises can access, as well as bigger companies, and so it's going to you know, enable a lot of these small companies that don't necessarily have those kinds of resources that big companies use on the ground to, you know, to achieve an ESG agenda that probably was otherwise unachievable.
Exactly.
That's a really great point, Edie. Thank you. I think we'll end on that point, because we are unfortunately out of time. And I mean that unfortunately, because it has been such an excellent discussion. I thank you so much, Ingrid, Meghan, Richard, Edie, and Laurie. Really valuable insights on such a crucial front for a lot of, for the entire industry. So thank you all.
Thank you very much, Anthony. And it was a pleasure to be with you today. And if you do want to have a demo of our system, simply call sales@onyen.com.
Fantastic. Sales@onyen.com, or if someone wants to be connected straight through to Laurie, just let our Laura Daly know and we'll make that happen. Thanks all.
Bye all.
Bye-bye.